So a little bit of a preamble. Do as I say, not as I do. In other words, the idea of my ever doing a commentary on any text, including Herodotus, is pretty alien, whereas we have at least one commentator present with us. I shall come back to her shortly. The aim of this talk is to be very, very frothy, to give the lightest of light touches. In other words, I'm not urging any particular theses or insisting, when I come to the issue of what should one say when faced with a particular Herodotean text, insisting on my interpretation, my inclusions, as being quite obviously superior to those of the commentators that I will be looking at. My hope, in other words, is to encourage you, as being asked to give this talk encouraged me, to go back and look at the green and yellow volumes of Herodotus that have been published so far. In other words, when they come out, in some cases they're actually sent to me because I've had something to do with their production, I rush to the Cambridge University bookshop in Cambridge, and often as part of my fee for having read some manuscript or other for Michael Sharp, or before him, Pauline Hire. And I am thrilled to get, normally in paperback, a copy of the latest green and yellow Herodotus at an extraordinarily reasonable price these days, beautifully produced, for an amazing amount of work that has gone into almost every sentence, let alone every page. So let me open then with a vote of thanks, which I'm sure you'll all echo on my behalf, to the Herodotus Helpline, to its founders, to Tom and Jan, to Francesca, to all those involved with making it possible for us to enjoy and share in this remarkable, both scholarly and purely friendly experience. And so I say on the handout, I'd like to thank also the many faithful participants. I confess I have been less than totally faithful. Not that I've been unfaithful in the sense that I've tuned into some other podcast or some other online seminar, but simply it's not always possible, as you will all know, to watch, to take part live. But in almost every case, I have tried to catch up with the recording, the YouTube, which I think is a fantastically valuable function. And a couple of people wrote me emails in the last few days saying, "Oh, Paul, I'm so sorry. I just have got something even more important to do right now. And so I can't possibly tune in live." To which I say, well, if you think that's going to exonerate you altogether, you're in a bad position, because actually it's being recorded, and that's what we did right at the beginning. So I'd like to thank you, and to thank the founders and my inviters. I'd also like to thank 3 commentators who, of course, are personal friends as well as fellow colleagues and academics, namely Carolyn, from whom we've already heard, Rosaria, whom I caught a glimpse of earlier, and Chris, that is Chris Helling. Now, my talk's going to be in 5 sections. First of all, I'm going to try to justify my saying anything whatsoever on this subject. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the series as such and as a whole. The green, it's an informal nickname, Green and Yellow. It's got a much longer title, which I'll come back to. And I'm going to look at an appraisal of the series as a whole. And then I'm going to go on to look at what I take to be its mission. Thirdly, and this is just boring, but on the other hand, it may be useful to have a visual record of it in front of you, to give you the stats, how long proportions as between text and commentary and introduction, whether or not there are any illustrations, that sort of thing. Then fourthly, fourth element, I've selected just a couple of common themes, common that is to the introducers, or and to, that is the introductions to the commentaries, or and to Herodotus. And finally, I very arbitrarily selected just one each, pretty much, from each of the published commentaries so far, a text, not so much adversarially, as I said at the beginning, to set my infinitely superior views against those of the commentators, but to illustrate the range of what could potentially be said about such a passage or other. So first of all, what is my, and this is on your screen now, authority? And I use that word, you could probably guess why. John Marincola's absolutely standard fundamental work, 1997, is being reprinted. And very recently, this will show up on your screen shortly, a volume which in fact is a Feshrit, but can't be marketed as such by the CUP, though its launch was in Oxford just a few weeks ago, sets at risk, or sets in headline, the issue of, in this case, Herodotus is an author, a narrator, an interpreter's, well, authority, based of course on a Latin, not a Greek word. So what authority do I have to talk to you about Herodotus from the point of view of commentaries on his work? What skin, this is another now current metaphor, do I have in this particular game? Well, I started reading Herodotus at school, what the Americans would call high school. So I was about 16 or 17. I went to a private school in London, a very old one, founded in 1509. And it was founded by a humanist called John Colet, who was Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. So in other words, he was the CEO of it, as it were. And very, very wealthy man and very philanthropic, a bachelor, and therefore when he died, he bequeathed money to philanthropic causes, including a particular school, St. Paul's School, in what was originally where St. Paul's Cathedral is, but then was moved to West Kensington. Now it's south of the river in Barnes. At any rate, when I went in the early 60s, St. Paul's School, of course, covered the range of academic disciplines, but classics was judged on what we now call the arts and humanities side to be the premier academic discipline. Such a degree that there was an accelerated progress through the various forms, such that one started doing ones what were called in those days, well, they still are called it, but they had rather a different composition. Anyway, A levels, advanced levels, at the age of 16, as opposed to normally now 17, I think. In fact, I took 3 A levels twice in successive years because I was 1 year ahead, as it were. Anyway, in the what St. Paul's in its wisdom calls the 8th form, not the 6th form, that is right up the top of the school, you started to read large chunks of ancient texts in the original, Greek and Latin. So my first experience of reading Herodotus then, minus any benefit of any modern commentary, of course, was in the early 60s. And I think probably all of us will recall the shock. If you started learning Attic Greek via typically Xenophon, and then you read Herodotus's Ionic Greek in a totally different idiom, different grammar, different vocab, the whole schmear, then that was my first, if you like, shock. But of course, like most people, I loved him. And then at Oxford University, where I studied at New College between 1965 and 69, reading what is then called mods and greats. It's now called classics. Oddly, very oddly, one of the compulsory section of greats, that is part 2, that is ancient history and philosophy, was to read Herodotus and Thucydides for the purposes of being set supposedly unseen, in other words, not set text, translation. So I read the whole of Herodotus, probably more than once actually, in the original, and you get up to quite a good speed after a while. And of course that deepens one's affection as well as increases or enhances one's understanding. So one hopes. I've written a couple of articles specifically on Herodotus, and they're on the screen. Tom, you can move on to the next bit of my handout. That's great. Now, and one of our members very kindly mentioned Tom Holland's Herodotus translation, actually 2013. So it may seem like yesterday. Same with me. Time gets telescoped. I don't know about time in Herodotus, but time in Cartledge terms. And so Tom read English at Cambridge University. He'd done Latin at school, no Greek whatsoever. And he taught himself Herodotean Greek in order to translate Herodotus, without, that is, going through, as I and people such as I went through from the age of 11 in my case, starting to learn Attic Greek. Anyway, to cut to the chase, Tom Holland and I collaborated intimately over a couple of years. He would do a segment, a section, send it to me. I would then, as it were, use my red pencil. And as I say, he is a literary person rather than an academic textual scholar. And also rather than the sort of historian I am. His use of language is infinitely superior as English. And his primary consideration, and this is always, isn't it, a big debate about translations, and I'm going to come on to another one, which is particularly relevant to another of our participants, Don. It's always an issue, isn't it, whether what you want to end up with is beautiful English, in other words, an equivalently literary product in the language into which the original is translated, or a version which is, well, literal is a terrible word, but because there's never an unambiguously, quite strictly 100% literal translation, but one which much more faithfully reflects the word order and the emphases and the length of the original. And I end with the length because I think this is probably the limit case. Tom at one point sent me something which translated 7 of Herodotus's words with 22 of his English words. Now, that to me is an unacceptably great disparity. But what he was aiming to do, as always, was to get behind, suppose you were an ancient Greek and you'd automatically used a particular phrase, but to an English speaker, that phrase or the sentiment or the logic or whatever behind it was not immediately obvious and transparent. He would try to bring out the implication of the Greek into English, which implied, of course, that his grasp of the Greek was pretty hot, and I would have to go along with that. So it was rare that I had to say to him, no, that just simply won't do. But there were a lot of cases where I had to say, look, you haven't quite got the nuance right. And I would cite a comparative usage or something like that in Herodotus to try to bring him back to what I thought was more faithful in quotation marks. So Tom Holland's Herodotus, a new translation with introduction and notes by me, came out in 2013, originally in hardback, 2014 in paperback. And I would just add, all translations have their limitations. So you try to overcome them in various ways. Well, one way we tried to overcome a certain aspect of limitation was by including what we called a glossary index, so that it was both an index and a glossary combined into one. And I put it that way because I was inspired by Don's, and we're going to come on to this, reworking of a very much older translation, but including wonderfully helpful indexes. So that's a little tribute there. And in fact, it's on the handout directly after that. Full disclosure, I actually prefer, for various purposes, not strictly as literature, but as a translation of Herodotus's Greek, G.C. Macaulay's 1890 translation, which was reprinted and re-edited by Don for Barnes and Noble Classic editions in 2004. And that is the translation that I shall be reading from when, right at the end, I come to talk about a few key texts that we might think about when we're looking at different commentaries. For the Herodotus Helpline, this is something which Jan has been responsible for me at any rate. Someone sends in a query, could you talk about, and in this case, one of them was, I thought, a really a kind of side swipe. Anyway, it was called, how reliable was Herodotus? Well, if we had other comparable works that we could set side by side, and we knew something about the reality behind the two texts, then that would have been an awful lot easier question to answer. At any rate, another question, more straightforward, but not entirely, was what was Herodotus's itinerary, or rather itineraries, that lie behind his supposedly autoptic accounts? And of course, there's a massive little problem in there, namely, did he actually travel ever much? Or did he read about it and talk to people about where he went, or said he went? Well, there are passages where it seems pretty clear that he would be found out, shall we say, had he been lying that he really had been somewhere. On the other hand, what about Herodotus and Babylon? I don't count Armayor's problem with Egypt in the same category, but there are issues over his account of Babylon in book 2, which, or is it the end of book 1, which remain, I think, open. So, second segment or section. Why bother? Why have I chosen this topic? Or why indeed should you, as students of Herodotus, bother with the green and yellow series? And as I was thinking about this talk, I was in touch with Chris Pelling, among others, and he put me on to a very interesting recent entire discussion, taking the series as a whole, so therefore not in any way privileging the volumes on Herodotus. But before that, I'll come back to that. One of the two original founding editors of the series, who may, for all we know, actually be listening right now, I'm referring to you, Pat Easterling, Professor Pat Easterling, issued a kind of follow-up manifesto to the series. In other words, what she and Ted Kenny on the Latin side, Pat on the Greek side, what they originally thought the series as such was for. And so we have Easterling and Kenny, a note on Cambridge Greek and Latin classics. And this was in a BICS, Bulletin of Institute of Classical Studies in London, supplement number 101, 2007, entitled Classical Books, Scholarship and Publishing in Britain since 1800. Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much. And as I put in the square brackets there, just selected a couple of the quotations. Suitable for sixth forms, that's what I was talking about when I first read Herodotus at St. Paul's School, and undergraduate students. Now, suitable for them doesn't say suitable only for them. And there is a question mark in my mind over what now? That was 2007. We're in 2023. Things move fast. Counts as suitable for undergraduates studying what? Which courses in which universities in which parts of the world? So there's a, let me just put a question mark over suitable and a question mark over undergraduates. I'm in absolutely no doubt that they are all, the ones in Herodotus' case, and no doubt a fortiori, almost all in the series, suitable for us, fellow scholars. The next item, the next quotation, is possibly the most problematic, and this is true not only of Herodotus, but of any historical author from the ancient world, knowing as we do that their works have survived, not for the acuity of their historiographical consciousness and analysis, but because they wrote in such a way, that is, in such literary form, with such literary merit, that it was deemed worthwhile to copy them, and copy them and copy them until eventually the age of printing dawns, and thereby, barring a nuclear holocaust, those works that had made that cut survive to this day. So the next quotation, chosen for their literary interest. Now, does that mean that they had no other, or primarily for their literary, and or can we historians separate off history and literature? I come back to an essay along those lines that Kenneth Dover once wrote. And then finally, this is just my selection from what Pat and Ted wrote. Emphasis in both the introduction and the commentary should be on the work concerned as a work of literature, which of course all of these are in some trivial descriptive sense. But then the question arises, did Herodotus think he was composing anything that would retrospectively, in his view, rightly be called literature? I'll leave that open. So I mentioned that Chris pointed out to me an article, an essay, which dealt with the series as whole. And it's by my dear friend Roy Gibson, who happens to be president of the Roman Society just now. And he, whatever his other qualities, is a Latinist rather than a Hellenist. Nevertheless, he strove manfully to give equal weight and equal attention in his long essay to Greek as well as to Latin texts in the Green and Yellow series. So 50 years of Green and Yellow, that is 1970 to 2020. So instantly that excludes one of that is our Herodotus Green and Yellows from consideration. And they were essays in honor of Chris Stray. Now, Chris is not terribly well at the minute, but he has performed wonders in rescuing the history of scholarship on the classics from oblivion and giving it a central place in our estimation in our studies. Of course, it's part of what are broadly called reception studies, but then I tend to take the view that pretty much everything I do and everything most of us do is reception studies in a certain sense. At any rate, that volume, Festschrift, in 2021 was part of de Gruyter's Trends in Classics, Scholarship in the Making series, edited by Montanari and Rengakos. Now, I'm just again, as with Pat and Ted's essay, going to select just a few points that Roy makes. Can you have a go, Tom, at moving it on to the next page? Yeah, okay. So he writes a historical account of the invention, the inauguration of the series as a whole, page 179. More interestingly to me, or as interestingly to me, he sets out by decade in a footnote the rate of production of volumes. In note 89, he goes to an issue which I've already been raising and marking, the issue of the genre of the historical commentary. He includes reference to the Herodotus volumes there. And then at page 202, and this, I'd be very interested to hear if anybody has a view on this, that in terms of hermeneutics, by which I take, Roy, to mean the way in which people who read literature today, I mean, starting in Eng-lit, but then moving out into really any lit, see their role as an interpreter, hermeneus being Greek for a translator, but also for an interpreter, generally conservative. Does that mean not, for example, taking full on the advances, or at any rate the suggested advances in, for example, narratology, focalization? I'll come back to that briefly later on. Just in passing to say that Roy has also written insightfully on another CUP commentary series, Orange, and he entitled his piece something like 50 Shades of Orange. And as I say, in both essays, he very skillfully situates the two commentary series within. And this is another issue, isn't it? When we're looking at a series over 50 years, well, what's happened to classics, the meaning of classics in those 50 years? I'm tempted to say that actually the most, if you like, threatening, as well as deeply self-critically investigative understandings and analyses of classics have come after 2020 rather than in the 50 years before. But nevertheless, you see what I mean. And then just a final little bit on the idea of the historical commentary. Chris Pelling himself has written on Gom, and of course Gom is just a shorthand for Gom, Andrews and Dover. Historical commentary on Thucydides, and implies, of course, the meta commentary. Now, this I think was to me a novelty, in rate, of Simon Hornblower, who commented on Gom's commentary on Thucydides by, of course, adding his own commentary, but it was not merely his own commentary directly on Thucydides, but it was mediated by the Gom trio. And so one might wish, for example, if you're looking at Thucydides, to compare and contrast Andrews and Dover as commentators with Gom as a commentator on the books that he managed to complete. On the other hand, one might wish to contrast Dover with Andrews. To me, almost chalk and cheese, but certainly very different kinds of historians, despite the fact that Dover considered everything that he did to be history. And that to me is controversial. If you like, we can come back to that. And so I move on, still within this second section, to the mission of Green and Yellow and the Herodotus Helpline. Well, we know what Herodotus Helplines is. It's to promote, develop, and maintain understanding of Herodotus's histories the world that they describe, and the reception of his work from antiquity to the present day. Well, apart from the quite extreme, I think, emphasis on literature, on studying Herodotus and all other works in the Green and Yellow series as literature, that I think would work perfectly well for the mission of the Green and Yellows. Quick disclaimer, I've used many commentaries, many Anglophone mainly commentaries, because of course there are French, German, Italian, you name it. Since the 1960s, I started with Howard Wells, which was explicitly a historical commentary that is not literary, very much not going into the nuances of Herodotus's diction, prosody, and what have you. I moved on, or rather back, to McCann, 19th century, very radical, in some ways much more radical than either Howe or Wells. But for this talk, I haven't systematically compared, as many of you no doubt will have done, their commentaries with the Green and Yellows. So let's look briefly then at the Green and Yellows. We're in now, thank you very much, section 3. And this is what I call the stats. And so I've set out who the editors are, the date of their production, and I've done it in order of books rather than in order of publication. I've given the wordage and the fact that in the first case, only 17%, this is something one gleans from Roy Gibson, only 17% of the editors in the series as a whole are women. And I also note in brackets here that 536 pages may very well be what Volume 1 and Book 1 demands. But Pat and Ted, I think, had a lighter touch version in mind when they set the series up. And I seem to have read somewhere that the upper page limit was supposed to be, that is including introduction, text and commentary and bibliography, and between 220 and 250. The book also has 4 maps, 1 city plan of Babylon. The introduction is 91 pages. The text itself is 81 pages. So the text, or the introduction, is longer than the text. Commentary 307, bibliography 32 pages. And in that bibliography, they cite most worthily 19 other commentaries. There are 2 indexes, as indeed is standard, though they differ as to what they are, a general one, and then a Greek words and phrases thought to be specially worth drawing attention to, just a page. And so on the top basis of that, I say RCT and Roy says RTC. So we're talking about the ratio of the commentary to the text. Roy has noted what he calls commentary creep over the 50 years of the series as a whole. In other words, the proportion of commentary to text has increased. And in this case, it was 3.75 or so to 1, which somewhat ironically, given the length of the book as a whole, actually reverses the trend of commentary creep, which is that commentary should increase proportionately to text. Book 5 is edited by Simon Hornblower, 2013, 351 pages, but with one interesting, I think, nuance and addition, namely Angus Bowie, who in 2007, as you'll see below, had edited for the series Book 8, was asked to write a language and dialect introduction. I do recommend that very strongly because I don't think anywhere else does one get quite such a concentrated summation of that dimension of Herodotus, which I'm going to come back to. It has 5 maps. The introduction is 47 pages long, commentary 219 pages long, bibliography 27 pages, 2 indexes, subject index, and Greek words and phrases. The RCT is about 5 to 1. That's what Roy was talking about, really. Book 6, edited jointly, as was book 1 by Carolyn and Rosario. This is by Simon and Chris. Came out in 2017, and it has altogether 342 pages with 7 maps. So there's an increase there. 2 figures. Now, none of the others yet have figures, so I looked them up with special care. One is of the Brescia sarcophagus. This is circa 2nd to 3rd century CE, and it shows a scene which interpreters have taken to be, as it were, a visualization of a passage of Herodotus about the Battle of Marathon. The other figure is a modern copy, a cast of a Braronian bear, that is the devotees of Artemis, who called themselves Arctoi bears at Artemis Braronia. And this cast is what greets you if you go, as I recently have, through Eleftherios Venizelos airport, the city airport of Athens. So my point is this, that the series clearly doesn't want readers, or doesn't maybe want to pay to have lots of illustrations that would be, for example, contemporary images on pots or on stone, or excavation reports. What I'm talking about is material culture doesn't seem to be highly privileged as a consideration. So next one, dear Tom, Book 8, Angus Bowie, 2007, 258 pages. And this is one of the series that Roy happened to mention specifically in his general essay. And he noted its emphasis on grammar. And that is one of the issues, I think, isn't it, today? Suitable for undergraduates, yes, but which undergraduates? Undergraduates for whom knowledge of ancient Greek, and in particular Herodotus's Ionic Greek grammar, is salient or even important. This time, the authorship is not confined again to the editor, but what we have, very interestingly, is Stephanie West adding a life of Herodotus. Well, that in itself is hugely controversial, other than documenting every personal reference. And of course, famously, Carolyn counted them once, his 375, I think it is, references to himself using the pronoun I. The issue there is we have, apart from Herodotus's own text, very little that's at all usefully reliable on Herodotus's life. And it says a lot that the most concentrated single ancient, I believe, record, so-called, of his life is in the Suda, the 4th 10th century or so Byzantine lexicon, which tells you the names of his father and uncles, and that he came from a place where there were Carians as well as Greeks, and all that sort of very, very interesting stuff. But what you don't get either in Herodotus himself or in any other source. 3 maps here. The introduction is 36 pages, text 47, commentary 252, bibliography 16, 2 indexes, Greek. That is Greek words and phrases, mainly grammatical. That corresponds to what Roy picked up, the emphasis on grammar. And then you have a general index, which is very short, I felt, only 4 pages. The RCT 5 to 1, so quite high in the range. And finally, book 9. Now, this one, like book 1, I had a little bit of a contribution to make to, because they asked me to read through a complete draft. And one of the things that was interesting was, and it may be relevant, it may not, to Rosaria and Caroline. They started out with the notion that John would be, as it were, satisfying the literary criterion, the one that should be more emphatic according to the founding principle of the series, whereas Michael would be, quotes, the historian. That distinction very soon collapsed. And so whether one can tell which wrote which entry or which part of the introduction, I certainly personally can't. Anyway, again, this is one that Roy mentions specifically in his essay, note 76, and he gives a wider scope of reference when referring to this particular volume. And it's dedicated to Chris Pelling, which seems to me utterly appropriate. I'm just thinking whether I've skipped over volume 6, which is, no, I think I didn't. I think I didn't. So that was Chris Pelling's volume with Simon. Yeah, sorry for that. That very Herodotean digression. And so their volume has 3 maps, 2 figures. So I thought, oh, figures, would that be illustrations of maybe the, shall we say, the stele of the commander of such and such, or something like that. But no, it was a family tree of Pausanias the regent. And secondly, a diary, as they call it, days 1 to 13 of the Plataea campaign. Of course, book 9 is basically Plataea, as book 8 was Salamis, and book 7, Thermopylae, and so on and so forth, 6, Marathon. And the interesting innovation here, I think, is the number of appendixes, 4 of them. So one on Simonides, well, you can see where that comes in, partly textually, partly historically. Thysaminus the seer, now that wasn't, I think, obligatory, but it may be because he was a seer, and therefore the religious dimension, that they thought this was worth pulling out from the generic discussion of the references to Thysaminus elsewhere in the work. The Oath of Plataea, well, I wrote a whole book on that wretched thing, so I can well see why they might have thought that that was important. Of course, what you're doing there is comparing much, much later texts with, was there a moment in Herodotus's account where one could have inserted such an oath, if such an oath ever was sworn? And then finally, fourthly, the battle lines, the names of the 2 contending opponents. Bibliography, relatively short, in other words, not hugely long, 19 pages, and 2 indexes, Greek words, and a general index of 10 pages, RCT 4:1. So retrospectively, the highest ratio of commentary to text are in books 5, 6, and 8, whereas book 1 in total, almost twice as long as most of the rest, as I believe it should be, because if you're kicking off a series, you want to absolutely go into every possible dimension that's going to come up later, as well as what you're actually fixedly focusing on in your particular book. So, 4th penultimate segment, pulling out common themes or threats. Now, there could be, of course, many others, and this is just a very short selection, really for the purposes of our session together. I could, for example, have added Greeks versus non-Greeks, which seems to me absolutely basic, but the 2 I've selected are literariness as against historicity. about which I'm not going to say much more because I've really been into that a great deal. And secondly, religion. Just as a footnote to indicate the sort of thing we don't know about Herodotus, what we do know about Kenneth Dover, because he tells us, he's told us. We don't know whether Herodotus carried with him huge numbers of wax tablets, huge numbers of papyrus rolls. Would he write up every evening a summary of what he'd heard at whatever place he was, or whatever other text he'd read, such as there were texts in his day available to read? We don't know anything about his methods of work, unless somebody is going to tell me, Paul, you've missed an absolutely fundamental piece of evidence. How could you possibly not realize? Anyway, Dover tells us how, in order to write his autobiography, I'd love to have had an autobiography of Herodotus, that in order to write his memoirs, which were published as Marginal Comment in 1994, and then they're going to be republished with lots of editorial baggage around them sometime later this year. In 1981, Dover set his papers in order. Well, I just couldn't possibly begin to think what that might mean in my own case. I don't want you to be able to look at the state of my library from which I'm talking to you. So, religion, let's just pull that theme out, and I will then illustrate it by reading from the Macaulay Latina translation, not the Holland Cartledge translation, 4 passages, one from each of the so far published commentaries. And as I put here, this is meant to be witty. The true thoma is that all the Greek and Roman, green and yellow editors, excuse me, cite a certain T. Harrison's work, Divinity and History, The Religion of Herodotus. And there is another general work, a general article, which is widely to be recommended, namely Chris Pelling on Herodotus and Samos, which is going to be relevant shortly, and particularly on religion, Herodotus, by Scott Scullion in the companion to Herodotus, the Cambridge companion of Carolyn and Chris. So, just before I get on to those passages, Rosaria has edited in 2 volumes, you'll all know this, a 2-volume companion to readings of Herodotus. That means modern works on Herodotus of a length that they can be included as long articles. And it has an incomparably useful index, both volumes do. Volume 2 is the one about Herodotus and his world, as opposed to Herodotus and how he wrote up what he wrote up, his narrative. And the index under religion has no fewer than 16 subheads. So we're talking about a really substantial topic with infinite, or at least very, very many possible gradations. So, first of all, in this section, I'm going to go quite quickly because you have it in front of you. I'm just illustrating to what extent and how did each of the commentators, or the pairs of commentators, see religion as a central or important facet, theme, thread in the book that they are commentating on. And so I set out how many pages in the introduction, and you notice book 5 has, I think, the most substantive in terms of length introductions. So book 1, Carolyn and Rosaria, index has lots and lots of subheads, which is rather like Rosaria's edited volume, including cults, ritual practices, divinity, gods as possible or presumed agents, festivals, non-Greek gods, non-Greek religious beliefs, seers, prophets, dreams. And why do I single out page 21 with the commentary on 191? Partly because we were discussing this in the helpline not so long ago, partly because the issue here is what Herodotus calls fated destiny. And that picks up, I think, or it correlates with what John Marincola and Michael Flower have to say about necessity in their introduction to Book 9. Book 5, as I say, very substantial, index, cross-references, epiphanies, gods, hero cult, oracles, pollution, priests, processions, sacred wars, sacrifice, and sacrilege. What it doesn't include, I'll come back to this, is belief. And that's, of course, a ticklish issue. Book 6, introduction, a long introduction, including religion, different cross-references, curse, Delphi, divine intervention, Dodona, epithets, festivals, gods, hero cults, oaths, omens, oracles, pollution, pythia, ritual, sacrifice, supplication, theoxany, but again, no belief. Okay, no entry for religion at all as such. Yeah, it's on the next page, Tom. That's it, thanks. It does have an entry in the index for divine order and long entries under oracles, and also Persians, religion, and quite interestingly, which one might possibly miss if you were looking just under religion. And Book 9, finally, no entry for religion as such, but a divine and human section, which includes discussion of gods and a very long index entry for divination. Right, my keynote text, I realize I'm trespassing on your valuable time, so I'm going to read out very quickly the bit of English that the commentary is on. So we start off with Book 1, chapter 142, section 3, and actually section 4. And so the excellent commentators rightly discuss the various ways in which dialects are presented in Herodotus. You remember what I cited of Angus Bowie having a section on dialect, and discussing them both as language and as culture. And this is a teeny tiny thing that I believe, I may be wrong, that could have had a little more commentary as opposed to a mere mention. And it comes right at the end of chapter 142, having pointed out that there are 4 different forms of language, Ionic language. The Samians, he says, have one for themselves alone. Now, one would love to know what he understood by glossa in this sense. You know, what aspects that we would understand as relevant to dialect did Herodotus include? But suppose I'd been commenting on that, I would then have introduced, I mentioned already, Chris Pelling's article on Herodotus and Samos. And I myself have written on Herodotus's contribution to our understanding of Samos's archaic history, and how he, as an exile, spent clearly quite a lot of time on Samos. So he had some basis for this assertion that Samian Ionic was in some way or ways significantly different from the Ionic of all the other Ionian cities that he mentioned. Second point, and you can probably imagine why I chose this one, because it's to do with Sparta. And we're in 510, and the Spartans are getting calls to go and liberate the Athenians. And the point of this is a passage which he almost repeats in book 9, chapter 7, section 1. What he says in the translation of Macaulay and the time it is, they, the Spartans, he feels he can generalize about them as a culture. And we have to remember he'd been to Sparta. He tells us, he even tells us the name, one of his 3 named informants he'd met in Sparta. So this is not from thin air. They held that the concerns of the god, hotheos, should be preferred, and the Greek is presbytera. They considered them more, well, literally old or grave or serious than the things of men. And similar wording is used in book 9. And why have I cited the paradox, which is referred to in the introduction to book 6? It's because you probably remember Herodotus gives many, many different people's alleged reasons why Cleomenes of Sparta, Cleomenes I, cut himself into bits, committed suicide circa 490 BC. How would he have known that Cleomenes did this? That's one thing. Why did they do it? Why did he do it? Well, he says the so-and-so says this, the Athenians say this, the Argive says, most Greeks say this, but the Spartans, and this is the point about the introduction in book 6, commentary, uniquely ascribed his self-immolation to his being, frankly, an alcoholic, because he'd learnt to drink his wine neat from Scythians. Well, now, the author of that commentary is very hot on the notion that there is a very sharp separation to be drawn, not just by them, but by us, between a secular and a religious sphere. I'm personally not entirely convinced that that's the case. But at any rate, point is that the commentator says uniquely the Spartans ascribed a secular motive. Perhaps some other people would like to comment on that, because the cross-reference to Thucydides is not, I think, helpful, because it omits the reason why Thucydides pointed out that when the Spartan armies marched to the sound of auloi, it was not because that was a religious function, but because it was a pragmatic way of keeping in step. And that doesn't seem to me to say that the Spartans could distinguish a secular from a religious sphere. My own personal view is that most things, most Greeks thought were ultimately religious. And so it's a matter of degree, but that there was no sharp separation of a religious space or sphere and a secular one. Democracy, well, you wouldn't be surprised that I include this here. Herodotus says, book 6, chapter 131. Excuse me, I've just got to locate it. Yes, Cleisthenes it was who established the tribes and the democracy for the Athenians. And if I had been commenting, I would have wanted to make the point this is either the or one of the 2 earliest uses of that word. I would have wanted that word put in the Greek words and phrases at the index at the end of the book. And I would have compared book 6, chapter 43, section 3. What exactly did he mean when he said that the Persians, 493-2, established democracies for the polis of the Asiatic region? And then finally but one, penultimately, ethnicity. 4 criteria are given, and this is a speech. And I won't read out the whole thing because it will be very familiar to all of you. All I would have added is a cross-reference to the passage that I'd given earlier about dialects, that is how you speak Greek, being an index of Greekness in different ways. The editor, this is Angus, does actually point out that religion was not a universal among the ancient Greeks, that was diverse, that their social customs were diverse. But I think he could have said a little bit more about what was counted as nomos and what was not, what was Hellenic nomos and what was not. But he overall interprets the speech. This is attributed, of course, to the Athenians speaking to Alexander of Macedon, that rhetorical purposes for Herodotus overrode any historical nuance. Now, that prompted the thought, prompted partly by Tony Woodman's book on rhetoric in ancient historiography. Isn't all ancient historiography somewhat rhetorical, and therefore might not rhetorical purposes systematically override historical nuance? Something to think about. And then finally, Spartan linguistic xenophobia or xenophobia. This is book 9, chapter 11, section 2. And again, it's important that Herodotus had visited Sparta and talked with Spartans, but more surely should have been said on the xenos bit of that, which, by the way, appears in 563 too. Xenia or xenia relationships were absolutely critical, both on the personal level and on the diplomatic level, not only in Herodotus' period, of course, but later, but especially in Herodotus' period, before diplomacy became extremely routinized and indeed reduced to formulae. Spartans now were in Thucydides' territory. Speeches of Pericles were supposed to conduct expulsions of xenoi. Well, the peculiarity of the Spartans was that they elided the distinction between non-Greek and Greek foreigners, calling them all xenoi, and not therefore using barbarians for foreigners, which rather diminishes, I think, the status of xenoi who are Greek, especially xenoi who are in a xenia relationship. All very Spartan, in my opinion, because they were odd and they had other linguistic peculiarities, especially in their homosexual vocabulary. And so I would have concluded by pointing out that Spartan linguistic peculiarity and idiosyncrasy was a key element of Spartanness. So if you have been, thank you so much